their lives being given. And 8 days later, Jesus takes his kind of inner circle of disciples. He takes Peter and James and John up the mountain to pray. That happens quite a few times, doesn't it, in Scripture, where Jesus goes up a mountain to pray. There's lots of things that happen in the Bible up a mountain. And there's some symbolism involved here as well. I guess there's that symbolism of being closer to God. I guess in our minds, even though we know it's not true, we think of God as up there. So up the mountain, obviously we are closer to God. And there's that symbolism there. Often people go up the mountain to hear from God, to receive from God. When we think of Moses receiving God's law, when he receives the Ten Commandments, he goes up Mount Sinai and receives it. And again, Jesus goes up the mountain and something, I think I put in the home group notes this week, something freaky happens. Something weird happens. Something out of the usual happens. And we read that Jesus' appearance changes. I'm not quite sure what that means, but his appearance changes. I guess the next bit could be the new advertising slogan for Bold or Ariel or whatever washing powder you use. His clothes were as bright as a lightning flash. And that brings back to memory Moses when he was in God's presence. And it talks about how his face was radiant because he had met with God. And the people were scared, and Moses had to put a veil on because they were scared in approaching Moses because his face was so radiant. And when Jesus is there and his appearance has changed, suddenly two men appear, and we are told that it's Moses and Elijah. And it talks about them appearing in splendor. And they're talking with Jesus. I just can't imagine what Peter, James and John must have been thinking at this moment. They must have been questioning, eating whatever they'd had the previous night or earlier on. They must have been wondering, what on earth is happening? This isn't the usual things. And when they hear Elijah and Moses speaking to Jesus, they're speaking about Jesus' departure. The Greek word that's used there is his exodus. And they're talking about what's going to happen in Jerusalem. What's going to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. Now, Jesus had told them a little bit, hadn't he, about that he was going towards his pending death. It'd be interesting to know if they made that link between. But again, that word departure, that word exodus, is full of symbolism. It brings to my mind the Exodus in the Old Testament and God's people being led out of bondage into freedom, out of slavery, into all that God had and has for them. And here it's talking about Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and eventually to the cross. That journey that would bring freedom to those who trust and believe in him. And then the next bit makes me laugh. Because it says in verse 32, Peter and his companions were sleepy. And it's quite often, well, maybe not quite often, but there's some other times, isn't there, where we find the disciples are sleepy. Up a mountain again, the Mount of Olives, is it, where they're sleeping when Jesus is praying before going to his death. I wonder if the disciples are always sleepy on mountains. I guess, to be fair to them, they'd had a long walk, hadn't they? They hadn't driven up the mountain, they hadn't gone, it's not like Snowdon, you can go up on the train. They'd actually walked a long way. And they were sleepy, they were tired. And then it says, when they became fully awake, and you can just imagine it, they're kind of dozing off, and then there's this flash, this lightning flash, Jesus' appearance is changing. And suddenly they're thinking, wow, and they're fully awake. And they see his glory, and they see these two men he's talking with. Again, Moses and Elijah, that would have been quite weird for them, seeing Moses and Elijah, these two kind of massive, well for us, massive Old Testament names. These two people who are used so much in God's purposes. These two people who, for these disciples, would have been so much in their faith based around these illustrious characters. Because these guys bring a lot of associations with them. They represent two key periods in Israel's history. You've got Moses, and we've mentioned the law already. And you've got Elijah being one of the major prophets, one of those who had God's message. And so you've got Moses and Elijah, you've got the law and you've got the prophets. These two foundational things for the Jewish faith, these foundational things to the disciples' faith. Moses and Elijah were key parts in communicating God's message to his people. His message that he desired a relationship with his people, with all people. They were a key part in communicating God's plans for his people, God's plans for bringing hope, for bringing fulfillment of God's ways. Sometimes we miss this kind of revolutionary message that Peter and James and John are receiving here, because I guess we are more comfortable with these kind of stories. Let me start that again. Sometimes we don't see it as such a revolutionary message as what it would have been for Peter and James and John there. Their lives are so focused on the law and the prophets. Just imagine what they were feeling when Jesus was speaking with Moses and Elijah, and especially with what happens next. Because just as Moses and Elijah are about to leave, Peter's always the one who puts his foot in it, he's always the one who opens his mouth and thinks later. And he says, "This is great, this is brilliant. Let's build 3 shelters for you. Let's build one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah." And Luke says, as a kind of little commentary next to it, he says, Peter didn't know what he was saying. And again, that makes me start to think, what's Luke trying to get at there? That Peter didn't know what he was saying. Did it just mean Peter was out of his mind and, didn't really understand that he was speaking? Was it that Peter was saying that we need to build 3 shelters because Moses and Elijah and Jesus are all of equal rank? So let's build a shelter for each one of them so they're all on the same level, and that will be our faith together. And then understandably, then Luke would run a commentary saying, well, he obviously doesn't know what he's speaking because Jesus, Moses and Elijah are not of equal standing. Or maybe Peter's saying he wants to build some shelters for them because he wants to keep this moment forever. He wants to kind of box it up somehow so that it'll always be there, available to them. He recognizes that this is a gloryful moment and he wants to keep it somehow. I guess in my mind I can compare that to maybe some big worship event I've been to, or maybe some big spiritual experience that I've had where I've wanted to somehow box it up. I've heard people talking about Spring Harvest and saying, wouldn't it be great if we could put that in a box and bring it here and open it up so that God's glory could be here as well. And I don't believe that, but that's what I've heard people say. And often experiences, we want to box them up, we want to keep them. We want to always be able to stay in that moment because it's so wonderful. We want to have those feelings on tap. And maybe Luke's saying to that, he doesn't know what he's saying. I'd have loved Jesus to have responded to this, but before there's chance for a response, in fact, it was whilst Peter was still speaking, a cloud comes down and covers them. And now again, there's symbolism there. We see quite a few clouds, particularly in the Old Testament, and particularly in the Exodus, God's presence coming in the form of a cloud. And we talk about the Shekinah glory of God, God's presence, his living presence amongst the people. And from this cloud there's a voice that says, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." I always imagine it being a really deep, booming voice. "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him."